So on your desks, you should have a copy of this. So this is the report really of the that comes from the research that we've done, and the project partners are mostly the transition countries. So as you see, everyone's in kind of like around the Balkan area. So we've got Croatia, Serbia, Macedonia, the UK, and Hungary, and then the Belgium is the Central Volunteer Centre, and it's been. We started kind of like around about the summer last year and kind of developing it, working out what we were going to do. All 6 partners interviewed volunteers and refugees who've been through camps, and then there was a conference in Croatia to sort of present how the national policy differences and the findings that we had, and then recommendations were developed in Serbia, and then now everyone's doing national conferences to share the results with people sort of in the 6 countries and get feedback from to refine them, and that will be taken to a kind of international volunteer centre conference that will be in Vienna. So we, in some ways, in Sheffield, what's different about us is we're not a border country. You know, we don't deal with people on the borders, where everyone else is dealing with people actually transitioning through their countries, or there's kind of like detention centres and camps, and we felt to some extent quite out of it, which is why we wanted to engage with everyone across the country and get you to here, because people who've been to camps, and then we've actually done lots of kind of interviews with volunteers who've actually been to camps, and then also to refugees. But one thing that was really striking was at the Croatia conference was the context that people are operating is so very different, and the biggest thing is this issue around transition versus destination countries. With people coming to the UK, once they arrive here, most people, this is where they want to be. And so in terms of engaging volunteers, it's much easier to engage volunteers here because people are kind of like here to stay. Whereas if somebody is literally, because you can build a relationship. It's easy to engage with volunteers, or for volunteers to engage with refugees, where we've got an opportunity to build a relationship and build some connection. Whereas in all of the other countries, they're transition. So refugees would literally turn up to a city, and then they'd want to go straight away. And there's a different dynamic there between the refugee and the volunteer, when the refugee is basically saying, to be honest, I really don't want to stay in Hungary, it's goddamn awful, I want to go somewhere else. It creates a different dynamic. Secure camps versus residential properties. We're the only country where people live in the community. You know, we have G4S properties or subcontracted properties, and there are issues. There are serious issues about the quality of the accommodation, and people will challenge that. But all of the other countries, asylum seekers are kind of in either they're in camps and they're kind of like locked up, or they have nothing. So it was really, really very different, and again, often with engaging with volunteers, people were not able to get into camps. So some of the camps were controlled by the government, some of them controlled by NGOs. But it was often those tight control places. Volunteers are not able to engage. So again, it's very, very different. And I think in many ways what we have here is quite a positive situation, even though it's comparatively positive rather than like objectively positive, if that makes sense. I'm not suggesting that people are in a good position, but it seems to be much better than all of these other places. And this organised versus spontaneous volunteers, that's a theme that came up through the research with groups or NGOs or governments kind of sometimes wanting to control things, and then volunteers or spontaneous volunteers operating in a different way. And what was fascinating is that there was sometimes kind of like, well, there was often tensions there. And in the research, you found out with volunteers sort of saying, well, NGOs weren't addressing the need. They were there, but they were controlling things. They were really limited in what they would provide, and they weren't actually making a difference. So we actually turned up and started addressing the needs that people had. Or other examples of, in the Calais camp, I mean, I'm talking secondhand, but people talking about how, that you weren't able to engage or volunteer with some of the NGOs if you didn't speak French. And so, kind of like rival kind of groups setting up the same operations were being set up because of funny bureaucracy, which didn't seem to make sense. Discoordinate or poor coordination between organisations and NGOs. And I think one thing that really came up is that there was sort of contrasting experiences. That I loved this quote, volunteers coordinated other volunteers that kept 4,000 people alive, which is amazing. I mean, you look at what happened in Calais, and I just want to say that all the stuff that you guys have done, just absolutely phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And there's a quote that people often say that no advice is better than bad advice, and there's certainly a value in that, and there's some truth in that. But there was nothing happening in Calais, and people volunteered, were moved to volunteer, and did an amazing amount of work. And we've heard horror stories, and we've heard things that were seriously bad, and I think there were some seriously bad things that happened. But you've kind of got to hold both things together, and that one doesn't necessarily overshadow the other. And that the work that volunteers have done has been incredible, absolutely phenomenal, done a phenomenal amount of good. And sometimes it's stepped in and alleviated issues where organisations haven't been hitting the mark. Other times it's undermined and thwarted things. Both things are true, and the purpose of today is to kind of not to judge one as good or one as bad, because that's not true. Both have been really good, but to look at there's really different skills and expertise that are both needed. For one thing, volunteers have mobilised far quicker and have mobilised without established funding. I'm conscious that as a volunteer centre manager, we have like good practice standards. So we don't advertise roles unless you meet certain standards. I stand by those. That's good. But there's a time in an organisation's development where you go out and you do, and your policies and your practices come later. And for us, there's a lesson of how can we engage with people when you're not going to meet our standards, and support you with knowledge and information and training and good practice, so that you can get on that journey towards a kind of like a recognised standard. And that's not easy. So these are some of the things some of the quotes that came back from volunteers and from refugees. And some of them, people talking about, lots of volunteers said, there needs to be some national coordination. This is particularly the European partners who are saying, it's just chaos. We don't know, we don't know how to apply, we don't know how to get involved, it's completely random. And that led to duplication and wasted efforts. Often people were not prepared. They just sort of said that, moved to respond, and the next thing they know, they're out there doing stuff, and really no training, and that had negative impacts. That hit some people, and poor communication and no limited support. Again, similar things from refugees about wanting volunteers to be better prepared. There's a lot of stuff about the conditions in the camps and improving access for information and training. We had a number of people saying that, from different camps, saying that you went to see a doctor and everyone's just got one pill, regardless of what their medical condition was. Which again, crackers. And we couldn't go. People did it anonymously, so I wasn't able to go back and interrogate what that was all about. But it came up from a few people in different countries. So again, really strange things. And it's interesting that refugees are saying that psychological or psychosocial support is needed for both them and for volunteers. So some recommendations for volunteers is shorter shifts. This is, people getting burnt out, basically. Again, more recommendations for psychological support and need for more volunteers in the field, as is always the case. And just out of curiosity, we only advertise roles if people pay expenses. Can you put your hand up if someone paid the expenses for your volunteering? Nobody. One person. Yeah. No. Okay. So that's what I would have expected to be the case. But yeah, this is so actually people volunteering to respond. It's self-funding. Now that anyway, that's self-funding. So that's an issue, isn't it? Which we can come back to. What migrants and refugees sort of talked about was translation, and again, people didn't really get the difference between staff and volunteers. Now, I think probably when sort of like the more spontaneous volunteer camps, it's probably because there weren't any, and that's what we got. But when in some of the established camps, again, it was the same thing. People didn't really get who was a staff, who was a volunteer, what was going on, and that was unstabilising for people. And coordination within the camps, again, I think that applied both to kind of Calais and established and non-established camps. So some of the recommendations, what I'll do is I'll go through these kind of fairly briefly, because then we'll give some time for questions and some sort of feedback. So these are all in your pack, so you can go through these if you want. So essentially, some of the key recommendations were improved coordination between decision makers. That's what came out time and time again. People turn up somewhere thinking that they're going to do a load of good. There was an example in Serbia where a whole load of asylum seekers landed were dropped in a particular town. A big call out went on social media and through emails and Facebook. There was a huge response where people came and donated food, resources, tent, set up a makeshift shelter within 24 hours. And then 24 hours after that, the government picked everyone else up and shifted them to a camp. And there was no knowledge about this, no time frame, no communication. So a huge amount of energy was put in and goodwill was put in by people, only for it to last for 24 hours. And that's communication. So that's a key one that's come up. And the same with between NGOs and the government. This key thing. Lack of communication is thwarting and wasting effort. And recognition of the value that volunteers bring. As you know, partly the situation is a policy decision, isn't it? There's been a policy decision not to engage, not to support volunteers, and not to put an infrastructure in to enable people to respond appropriately, or in a supported way, which is why nobody here got their expenses, because no organisation is really set up to coordinate it. And this message came up time and time again. I'm sure that's not controversial, but it's equally not something that's an easy one to solve. But this came up over and over again about volunteers needing training, support, kind of some kind of supervision so that they don't burn out, and repeated over and over. And then the final two was around empowering refugees, seeing that because people are in crisis, sometimes people have been doing stuff to refugees, and there's been people who say that some volunteers have been going there more out of a desire to feel good about themselves rather than a real primary focus on the benefit and how to empower and support refugees. And this is something that the empowerment workshop will go on. That's obviously I'm not saying that that's what everyone has, but these are things that have come through. And then the final one is around finding a really appropriate way to value and recognise what spontaneous volunteers is the word that has been used in the project. Spontaneous volunteers or activists do, where there's a huge resource there. It's untapped. It's a bit chaotic, but it brings an awful lot of value, an awful lot of skill. Often, and sometimes it thwarts things, and sometimes, you know, lack of knowledge causes damage, and sometimes, you know, there are issues, but there's also advantages, and established organisations, particularly over Europe, have sometimes just seen it as just a negative, and what's come out through the research is that there's a need of a way to engage and to draw out the positive, and to reflect on the challenge that they bring to the established organisation. So that's a summary of the findings. So actually, Tim, can I give you the mic? And I just wonder if anyone would have any comments or questions or any response. Would anyone like to?
Well, just one thing really, sort of for instance in Calais, there's only really one person that's been employed by Care for Calais. There are no NGOs, there is no Red Cross, there is nothing. It literally is just volunteers that are going out and working with the charities. For instance, Social Workers Without Borders is just now getting charity status, but there isn't an NGO, there aren't any corporations or working there at all.
Yeah.
It is literally just those spontaneous volunteers that are keeping the whole thing running.
Yeah. That's amazing. I don't know what else to respond. Thank you. Well, obviously most of you in the room. Yeah, thank you. Well done. That's so anything? Do you have a recommend? What do we do about that?
Well, we try and get the governments to actually own some responsibility for these vulnerable people, instead of tear gassing their sleeping bags, or tear gassing them and pepper spraying their sleeping bags and things like that, and stopping us from distributing food.
Yeah. Anyone else? Sure.
Just to follow on that point. Just to follow on that point. I mean, I think we have to put on the table.
Yeah, I think it is on.
I think we have to put on the table that some governments, and it varies, but some governments don't want these people there, and so to be talking about coordination with government agencies is, in those contexts, is just not appropriate, because the volunteers are on their own. I've worked all my career in the humanitarian sector, and I've been trying to encourage humanitarian agencies to recognise volunteering, but they're pretty deaf to it. You know, it doesn't fit. You know, it doesn't fit with their models. They see volunteers as being hard work and transient, and underneath it all, it's as though they don't see this as a humanitarian problem. They see this as a government problem, and it's not their business. So even where NGOs, international NGOs, are present, there's still an ambivalence about their role, and even though they may be relying on volunteers to actually do a lot of the frontline work, they're still not prepared to invest in them or acknowledge that we're being paid and you're not being paid. You're here funding yourselves. We're here, with salaries. We knock off on Fridays. You volunteers can look after the people that show up on the Saturdays and the Sundays. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
I'm Marjorie, a retired nurse and midwife. It's got a personal project, Family Link-Up project. I've had the privilege of being able to stay in the Alionis camp in Athens, because some of my family members that I'm linking up are resident there. But I noticed on my last visit in March and things that things were a little bit tighter, where there was a much more free flowing of volunteers coming in. There was a little there was more restriction. And I think we've got to be careful, because when I talked with one of the security guy, is that she was saying the problem is people have been negatively reporting about the camp. And I said, well, I can't negatively report about it. I think you're doing an amazing job, and I recommend you all to read the 2006 report, which I have got on my blog, with Greece, to show that they have pre-existing social problems before this refugee crisis. They were in a situation where they were giving transient support, and of course the borders closed, so suddenly they've got all these people to cater for. And what I do see in the Ionis campus is a very strong attempt to, and a successful attempt to give dignity. All the prefab huts, we've got flushing loos and hot water and things and that. They have obviously daily food given and things that some of the ready-made stuff is a little bit like, school dinners. But we get food out in there's that lovely Sunday market where you can get fresh food outside. And we go into Athens to get things. And this is another thing, what you just picked up about with governments not wanting people there. It's like I find that if I go with some raw cash, both in my family members in Turkey and also in Greece, to buy products, because the local traders need to feed their families and they've got the products that we need. It's nice to take things from England, and people love coming from England, but what is the point of getting excess baggage charges and taking cargo with you through Heathrow when you can actually get the things out there? And both in Turkey and in Greece, when I've been shopping with the family, there's a Marjorie, I really like what you're doing. I said, well, yes, you've got your families to feed as well. And I feel that that helps to soften the edge between refugee camp and community and turn what is perceived as burden into benefit, and also to do what I'm always wanting to do with us all, is to link us up as a global family. A global family, that's what we need to be, isn't it?
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think the experience in Greece, and you probably found that, was very much like that. The community and everybody, although there was flaws, it was working a lot more together. But in northern France at the moment, they're criminalising volunteers. So volunteers are being attacked by police now for distributing, and it's a major problem. And as for working with, governments and different things, they thrive on not letting anyone have any information about anything. So that's kind of like how they want it to stay, and it's becoming really, really difficult. And we have volunteers who are going out there. Everybody is completely demoralised. There's, obviously a lot of refugees who have been drawn right into the woodlands. There is no social structure for them. There's nothing. And there's just groups of volunteers who are out there trying to do all they can to meet needs, and they're actually being attacked for distributing water. So it's incredibly difficult. It isn't like talking about how can we improve this situation. It is how can this inhumane situation be. It's outrageous. I think it's worse there at the moment than it's ever been, well, since I've been involved. For the last sort of two or 3 years.
Can I just say one thing to add to that? Next year, of course, when we lose our European status as citizens of Europe, how are we going to get out there to help? Because if the police are picking on us now, we've got no right next year to be there. No. And that's what's really scaring me and worrying me. I'm thinking ahead about that, and
something that came up on our table, and it was bothering me as people were talking, is that there seems to be a high instance of rape in the camps by police and by fellow refugees and all the rest, certainly in Calais and around that area at the moment. And the issue is raised that apparently the women are offered implants, contraceptive implants. So there are organisations, and it would be probably government organisations, that are aware that women are being raped. And they're well organised enough and forward-thinking enough on that particular round to offer women implants, which suggests to me that they think it's perfectly normal and acceptable that this goes on, and I wonder whether that isn't something that should be brought up amongst NGOs, volunteers and everyone. Sorry, brought another issue to the table.
Thank you for that. I mean, what we want to do is air things here and capture stuff, and then we can put these things into a report. And I can't really respond. Yeah, I didn't know about that, but that's what.
The situation for women in Northern France is extreme, to the point where we as a charity were asked by the women of Dunkirk camp, before it burnt down, to provide incontinence pants because the refugees cannot go to the toilet because the incidence of rape is so high that it's more likely that a woman has been raped than hasn't. And but the issue is that when we go in and we seek help for these women, at the end of the day the traffickers have control. They will seek the women back out and they will get the women back in the camp. So we've got to the point of getting women into safe refuge, but then the traffickers will come along, they'll threaten to kill family members somewhere or whatever, won't they? And they end up, you go through the whole system of getting women out and they end up back in the camps, don't they? But the incidents are horrendously high, and it's not just women, it's children. It's kind of like, it's quite weird when you're sort of talking at this from an experience of someone trying to sort of work how organisations are working and issues. And if you work in the camps and you're aware of the issues, they're on a totally different level than, do you know what I mean? It's just a mad situation.
I'm aware that, we have an agenda and we've got our kind of exercises to go through, and some of that might work and some of it might not be relevant. But the overwhelming purpose of today is to capture that information and then, as a group, see how do we respond? How can we respond? You guys are responding. What else? Is there anything that this can do to support that? That's Sorry.
One of the things we talked about when we were in Brussels in November at another conference was around how this crisis is seen. It's not seen as an emergency crisis, the way you would have seen as Haiti or Nepal when they had the earthquake. So all of these big NGOs, they're not necessarily sending their best people out. They're sending people out to Greece, for example, UNHCR or Red Cross, to work there, but they're not the people who actually know how to manage crisis. And so one of the things that we've been grappling with is how do we push all of this back upwards, because it's got to go to the European Commission, that political will. We're all seeing this, the torture with the kids, the rape and everything. We're seeing it. NGOs, big NGOs all know about it. Why is this message not getting back up to the top? So the amount of lobbying that organisations like yourselves and this group and others needed to get back and push that message back up, because we're going to all do what we need to do to help people. Some of it may be legal, some of it may be illegal, but we're still going to do it because it's humanitarian, it's moral, and regardless of everything else. But how do we get that message back up? And that's one of the things that we've been talking about, and sort of how do we push up that political will so that they do take notice?
Good question. I want to say that I think it's the idea of this conference workshop is great because it's about improving the way we are working together in order to make it better. I would like to emphasize something you have said in the beginning, which is about how good the work that has been done so far, how good it is. I would like not to forget it when we have all the discussions, and taking as an example the level of organization or misorganization, and there are some recommendations about how to improve it. I would like us to also look in the way that the level of organization people that are not prepared, and people that are not being paid. The level of organization is incredible, and it's working for the girls and everything like a very well working machine. So, and I would like to keep that in mind, thinking that we need to improve, but we're doing well. And that is a key element that, yeah, we shouldn't criticize or think or get into that way of looking at it that we are not doing that well. No, we are doing well than anybody else in the world, people who have money, resources, power, and we need to do it better because we can.
Absolutely. I'm assuming everybody here would agree with that. Yeah, thank you. It's important. It's important that when you're looking at improvements, it's just looking at positively how can we do better, and there's no implied criticism, because it is 4,000 people. You know, the stuff that's been happening is phenomenal. So it's good. Thank you for bringing us back to that. Thank you. Should we take one more question and then we'll do, and then we're pretty much back on the agenda actually. So yeah, one more question, one comment.
I think maybe we should touch on, or just mention the fact that there's another factor that comes and disrupts organization of work of volunteers, comes between NGOs, is something that I became aware of while being in Dunkirk, and that's the fact that some of the organized camps are a honey trap for organized crime, and they're actually being run by organized crime there. This is the perfect opportunity for the smugglers to bring the customers to them, which in turn brings things like rape, or I don't know, I can't categorize it, but besides rape, there's the payment for the smuggler in a form of a woman's body, especially between different ethnic groups. If a certain ethnic smuggler will provide passage cheaper or safer for his own ethnic community, but for a different ethnic community, he will request the woman, and that happened in Dunkirk refugee camp all the time. I don't know how it happens now, but are these organized big camps bringing more bad than good sometimes? We need to see how the goodwill of the volunteers in the longer term does not provide easier opportunity for the exploitation of the refugees by the organized crime on the spot, and how can we avoid that? How can, through our volunteering, we not to create power struggles among the different ethnic communities, because this is some things that not everyone carries in mind, that if you help a certain group, it would give them apparently more power and will create more tension in the camp. Maybe we need to touch upon that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. That's a good challenge, and a good issue to raise. And I think there'll be opportunity to explore that in the workshops and do raise it. I think that was. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, there's some heavy things that have been raised, haven't there? It's a heavy issue.
That's why I always, I always write a report. When I go out, I always make a report that I submit to the UNHCR in London, the legal team, and I always give a copy to my MP. But the gentleman here has just raised something that has concerned me, where we've been picking up on some information that there are some volunteers going out that are paedophilias, and they're preying on the sort of young girls and things. This is absolutely not acceptable. When I practice as a nurse and midwife, I have to do an CRB check, and obviously people are just going out without any checks and things. And it is quite sad, isn't it, that people are preying on vulnerable like this.
Yeah, and I think these are there's some really serious issues that have been raised, and I just want to thank you for raising them. they're somewhat beyond us, aren't they? For us here in the room, they are beyond us. But the key issue is to look at, out of this conference, out of this raising of these issues and recognising them, how we move forward. And that's something that we'll think through throughout the day, and see what recommendations can come out, and then we will be inviting people to help with support with doing that. You know, that's what we want to do, because there's a question of who will do this. I don't know is the answer. This is not our core work. You know, we're just a mainstream volunteer centre in Sheffield. Our remit is to support local people in Sheffield, but this is something that we've got involved in because of we were quite late in the day actually, but the partners invited us in. It's something that we're passionate about, but we don't. We need to work together to actually, I think, make any significant change. So that's what we'll need support with that.